Thank you for staying tuned. Well, the 2019 Inequality Report, recently released by a UK-based non-governmental organization, Oxfam, ranked Nigeria low on gender equality and poverty eradication. The report ranks Nigeria 125 out of 145 countries on gender inequality. It also notes that 69% of Nigerians live below the poverty line. While it affirms the nation's economic growth in the last 6 years, the report describes the growth as a paradox, saying it does not reflect on the living standards of the citizens. Well, joining me now to look at this report is the Assistant Director, Research and Advocacy at Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Dr. Matthew Ojo. He's here in the studio with me, and of course, the Regional Advisor on Inequality, Oxfam, Kwesi Oben, joining us from our Abuja studio. Thank you, Mr. Oben, for coming through to us. All right, I'll start with you, Kwesi. Your report highlighted examples from Nigeria, and the report says 5 of Nigeria's richest men have a combined wealth of $29.9 billion US. That's more than the country's entire national budget for 2017, but about 60% of its citizens live on less than $1.25 a day. That's the threshold for absolute poverty. How so?
Well, that's what the data tells us. The data tells us that Nigeria and indeed West Africa, inequality has reached extreme levels. And this is worrying because essentially the thing is this: inequality is actually at the core of all the crises in the region. And so for it to have reached this extreme level means that we're actually sitting on a time bomb. And we want to draw the attention of the Nigerian government, but then also all West African governments, that they need to pay attention and address inequality as quickly as possible. And let me just quickly set this thing in context. So the analysis we did also checked to see how far in terms of the regional balance. So to see whether, compared with other regions in Africa, how West Africa fares. And we found out that citizens of West African countries actually live under governments that are the least committed. In the case, if you relate it to Southern and Eastern Africa, they are only about half as committed as these governments. And so I think we need to pay attention to it. And Nigeria actually comes at the bottom in terms of social spending, particularly on education, on healthcare, and social protection. So it's that dire.
Okay, Dr. Joe, of course you listened to Mr. Obeng there. Now, what are the things that strike you the most looking at that report?
Well, thank you very much for having me. First of all, if you look at that report, 69% of Nigerians live in poverty.
That's what they say.
In terms of numbers, but that report also said 112 million. When you speak numbers, at times people don't have full understanding. 112 million Nigerians means if you add the population size of 5 African countries, we're talking about Benin, Togo, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, even Senegal, it's still not up to 112. So the statistics is not just staggering, it's saddening that Nigeria is in this position. We're not supposed to be. Now,
talking about this number, would you say, do you think the country is actually doing enough? Are we doing enough as a country to reduce this poverty?
Well, we are doing something. Whether it's enough, that's a challenge. I don't think it's enough. Because if you look at the report, they consider 3 areas. Just like he mentioned, they looked at the social spending, they looked at taxation, and then issues surrounding labor rights. Now, if you look at the budget towards education, let's take from 2010 to date. Education, 2010, it was 4.83% of the total budget. And it started growing up. We were happy. But it stopped at 2015, when we had 9.98. And then in 2016, it dropped down to 6.10. Now, if you look at it, presently, the one in this year's budget is low. We just have, I think, is 4.1. So the challenge is that education is not well funded. And if you don't educate, that's the first point of call of inequality. You have people who can't, they can't read, they can't write. You have created a barrier from that onset. And going forward, that gap keeps on widening. So also is health. Health is not well funded in this country. Now, I just mentioned those statistics, but you also know that a large chunk of that percentage will be used for salaries. We are not talking about infrastructures in the health sector now. So education is having, we need to look at it properly. And then health, how many Nigerians have access to free health care? Now, if you look at also from what they reeled out, they told us that 57 million Nigerians do not have access to safe water. 130 million Nigerians do not have access to adequate sanitation. And then 10 million Nigerians are out of school. So this statistics is troubling because government doesn't seem to understand that they need to do more than they are doing, or maybe they feel they are doing enough. Another, if you also consider the fact that I think 2018, Oxfam, the commitment to reducing inequality index showed that Nigeria was 157 out of 157. We were the least. That report looks at the commitment of and the global commitment of nations or governments towards reducing inequality. And we are not doing well. The commitment has to go beyond this for us to get where we want to be.
Right. Okay. Let me talk to Kwesi now. Talking about countries, of course, that are committed. You talked about Nigeria not being committed. The report noted that Niger, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria are the least committed, while countries such as Cape Verde, Mauritania, and Senegal are most committed. Now, Kwesi, what are these countries, talking about Cape Verde, Mauritania, and Senegal, doing differently that Nigeria is not doing?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that's an excellent question. But just before I get there, I just wanted to shock you again with just a couple of data from Nigeria, just to situate my response. In the first place, over 10 million Nigerian children are out of school, as he rightly pointed out. And a girl from a poor home in Nigeria is 26 times less likely to get education compared to a child from a rich home in this country. And it's that bad. Well, the good thing is that, and we made a point quite clearly in the report, that inequality is not inevitable. It's not preordained. It's not fate. In fact, it's as a result of public policy. It's a result of politics, and therefore it can be done. And the good thing is that while some countries are doing nothing, and actually in many cases exacerbating inequality, in some countries they are doing they are moving in the right direction. A classic example, Cape Verde, but then also Senegal and Burkina. What these countries are doing differently, I just cite the case of Senegal. Senegal, over the last few years, has invested heavily, particularly in education and healthcare. And so today is the 13th highest investor in the social welfare of their people, particularly, as I said, education and health. And indeed, as a result of that, they are seeing a transition in terms of the access to quality of health. And so it's important that governments actually invest in these areas. And so essentially the point I'm trying to make is that what Senegal, Burkina Faso, Cape Verde are doing is that they are investing in some of the key areas that evidence points to the fact that if they are tackled, we will tackle the growing levels of inequality, and that is education, healthcare, and also social protection. And let me just add quickly. So the thing is this, all the countries are doing one thing or the other, but the scale is not enough. It won't tackle inequality. And also some of them are taking taxes and investing them in failed health insurance schemes. And so we need to pay attention, particularly as this country, as Nigeria, goes through a review of the health insurance scheme you have. And let me just make one additional point, and I think it's very important. Fact of the matter is that the evidence also points out that in countries where inequalities are high, lives of the poorest are shorter and brutal because they cannot even afford, life-saving healthcare, let alone, other basic services just to be able to move out of the to move up the economic ladder. And so the evidence points out that this is dire and and there are solutions. It's not as if it cannot be done or others are not doing. The evidence, even from our own region, points out that if governments are committed, they can actually use public policy and they can change the situation. And that's the message we want to send across, that Nigeria's situation is not fit and that it can be addressed.
This is also for you. Now, I know that some of these reports are meant to guide the government on the right path. So how much have, this government really done? Do they really pay attention to some of these reports you churn out every year or quarterly?
Well, the good thing is that this year marks the fourth year of the review of the Sustainable Development Goals, and countries, including Nigeria, are supposed to provide voluntary reporting of their status of inequality, goal 10 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we think that the time of the release of this particular report, it's important because countries are reviewing and assessing how far they've come in terms of being able to meet their SDG goals. And we also know that citizens, so let me put it this way. The thing is that we recognize that inequality cannot be addressed by just simply governments. But without governments, it's impossible to address it. And I think citizens do have a role, and that is to make the demand on the government to actually invest in the areas that they deem most appropriate. And we think that what is important for poorer sections of the population is that they get access to quality education for their children, and then also quality and accessible healthcare, so they don't have to die from, preventable diseases like that we know of in our region. And again, let me just quickly point out that I think that there is pressure on governments around the world, and particularly in our part of the world, to address inequality. Mind you also that the crisis we had in 2015 around the Ebola was precisely because of inequality, because the poorest were the ones that died. The thousands that died in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea were essentially the poorest of those societies. And so we do feel and we do think that it is not just simply timely, it's in the interest of our countries, it's in the interest of this country to invest in the education of the next generation, invest in the healthcare of the population, and ensure that they tackle the gaps that, the tax gaps that they've created in the domestic regime, which allows, the top 1% to be able to make so much wealth, such that, just the top 5 wealthiest men have more than, what the country devotes for the whole country in terms of the budget, as you rightly noted back in 2017, that the wealth of the top 5% of Nigerians actually exceeded by $5 billion the country's entire budget in 2017. This is unacceptable, let's face it.
All right, Dr. Joe. Now, aside from whatever the federal government perhaps may be doing, do you think the state governments are actually doing enough? Because when we talk about reducing abject poverty and bridging the gap of inequality, it's not just the responsibility of the federal government.
Yeah, I quite agree with you. You see, unfortunately, in this country, attention is more focused on the federal government. But like you rightly pointed out, the states are not doing enough. Because if the government at the federal level is being looked at, we also need to focus on the states. Budgetary allocations to health and education in states, you just see paltry sums. And like I've also noted earlier, most of these allocations are meant basically for salary payment. Infrastructure-wise, it's close to zero. So if you notice what is happening, you find out that what government at the state level have succeeded in creating is the private sector comes in. But even at that, it's still those who can afford it. So you have people dying at home, not able to go to hospitals, and general hospitals are almost like no-go areas in many of these states. So the states need to do a lot more if we really want to get out of these woods.
And what role can the private sector play in all of this?
In all of these, you see, it probably could have been worse, if not for some NGOs that are helping out. You have NGOs helping out in areas of in education, also in health. Left to government alone, he also said, things would have been worse. Honestly, all hands have to be on deck to correct what we are seeing now, because it's pretty bad.
Right.
It's pretty bad.
All right, Mr. Kwesi, talking about the role the private sector can actually play in bridging this gap of inequality and reducing poverty in Nigeria and West Africa at large, what is your recommendation?
Well, so again, the private sector has a role. Indeed, we know from the evidence that the bulk of the revenue, this country and this region has seen remarkable economic growth over the last decade. Actually, from 2002, we've seen impressive growth rates. Just last year, 6 of the fastest growing economies in Africa were in this region. Whilst Nigeria did have issues in terms of growth and a bit of recession, the fact is that the country has seen remarkable growth. Part of this came from the exploitation of the resources of the country by the private sector. Unfortunately, the bulk of these revenues were shipped out of the country as illicit financial flows. Part of what the government and the private sector can do is to ensure that the government optimize its revenue mobilization such that it's able to mobilize revenue from particularly the private sector and reinvest in the social spending to address the inequality gap. So that is one way. But the other way is that already there are private sectors. I mean, your earlier program about the HMOs. So the private sector are playing some role. But what we are saying is that particularly the big multinational companies operating in this country are not paying their fair share of taxes. Part of it has to do with the fact that there are gaps in the fiscal regime, in the tax regime in the country. But these companies also exploit the international tax architecture to be able to shift their revenues out of this country, denying the country the revenue it needs to be able to provide some of the basic services and the citizens of this country need to be able to just live decent lives that we all desire.
Question, just before I let you go, what is the outlook like? How daunting is it? A quick one.
Well, sorry, can you come again?
What is the outlook like for Nigeria?
What the outlook is pretty grim because, as your other guest in the studio said, in the first place, Nigeria ranked lowest in Africa and also the lowest in the world. And that's not a good picture. And just oppose it against the fact that this is the biggest economy in Africa and one of the biggest in terms of population in the world. It's not as if the country cannot address it. The country has the capacity, has the human capacity, has the ability to raise the revenue it requires to be able to address the needs of the poorest 99% of the population. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's only the interest of the top 1% that is taken care of. And that is not good for the future of this country. As I said earlier, part of the crisis we have in this country in terms of security is down to also the fact that there's too much inequality. Too many people don't have the basics of life. And so that certainly it's a red flag. And I think that the government needs to pay attention to it and address the needs of the poorest of the citizens.
We really don't have much time here. A quick one. Any hope? Yes or no?
Well, there's hope, but the commitment level has to go beyond just political announcements.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Matthew Ojo is the Assistant Director, Research and Advocacy at Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and of course, Kwesi Obeng, West Africa Regional Advisor on Inequality. Oxfam. We take a break, and when we come back, we do an opening call to the markets. Just stay with us.